As we continue, let's do so in prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord our God, we thank you for your gift of love. And out of love, you have made us for yourself. And in this pilgrimage of ours here on earth, we ask for your help and guidance. That as we follow in the footsteps of those who have gone before us in faith, may we come to share full communion with them and you who live and reign, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So our presenter this evening is Greg Smith, and for 4 decades, Greg has written and taught about, as well as traveled throughout the Christian world, 30 of those as a Protestant. But after a decade-long road to Rome journey, Greg and his wife joined the Catholic Church in 2016. With his eclectic background, he brings a global perspective on the historic Christian faith. For those of you that were joining earlier, you got a taste of that as you were listening in to some of the conversation about the Holy Roman Empire. So currently, Greg serves as the Director of Ministries at Our Lady of the Lake Catholic Church. Welcome to those of you who made the trek in from Holland this evening. He also teaches at Lakeshore Academy of the New Evangelization and is founder of the newest ministry, One Whirling Adventure. Please help me welcome Greg Smith.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's just get into this. And I'm going to go for a while and then we'll pause and take your questions. So, but by all means, if you have questions, save them up, or if you want to just get a point of clarification in, go ahead and raise your hand, but whatnot. Or leave a remark in the question chat on the Zoom, and Mark will compile those. So we'll just get into this. I'm going to start with this statement. What Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel is to Catholic art, what Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia is to Catholic theology, what St. Francis of Assisi's Canticle of the Creatures is to Catholic understanding of the creation, what St. Augustine's City of God is to Catholic worldview, what St. Francis Xavier's writings and work are to Catholic missions. You get the idea. These are all the best and brightest of our tradition. That's what Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy is to Catholic literature. It stands among the best and the brightest achievements in the history of Catholicism and Catholicism, the Catholic Church's 2,000-year quest for truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, no doubt someone somewhere is bristling at that statement because I only included old stuff in it, in that list. Nothing from the last 500 years, much less the last 50. Isn't there been anything good done in the last 50 years? Well, maybe. But I think one of Catholicism's features, not a flaw, a feature, is that things move really slow, which means that it takes time to discern whether something is significant, okay? Things can seem significant to our generation, a song, a book, a movement, an idea that, you know, often 50 years, 100 years later, 150 years later, look pretty dated, like old-fashioned styles or, you know, old music. It was really big, you know, back in the day, but it looks old after a while. And over centuries, certain things really sort of pass that test of time. They withstand it. And it takes, I think, centuries to really get a perspective on whether something is ageless. You don't know if it's ageless until an age has gone by. And the things I mentioned are ageless. And Dante, and I'm going to share some reasons why tonight, stands in that ageless category. Now, excuse me. Now, Dante Alighieri is not a saint any more than Michelangelo or Mozart are saints. But like them, he was one of the most gifted artists that God ever gave the church. He reached for the stars, and he captured in this work a sublime glimpse of the true, the good, and the beautiful. So before I go any further, let's just be clear about what we're discussing, okay? Because not all of us are familiar with this thing, the Divine Comedy, or Dante Alighieri, who wrote it. Dante Alighieri was a Florentine, which means he was a native citizen of what was the city-state, the Republic of the city of Florence, okay? in what is now the nation of Italy, which was not a nation at the time. Yeah, okay, we're all good. He was born in 1265. And so therefore he was roughly a contemporary of St. Francis of Assisi and St. Thomas Aquinas. In fact, St. Francis of Assisi died in 1226, so just 39 years before Dante was born. And Thomas Aquinas died when Dante was 10 years old. Now, of course, in those days, publishing and everything moved a little more slowly than it does today, instant communications. So he was within a generation of those saints. And so the ideas and the things and their accomplishments were very current for Dante. He was at that height of the Middle Ages. Now, in the city of Florence, in Tuscany, he became a poet. And in his early years, he became famous for writing what we might call courtly love poetry, to ladies and this kind of medieval florid love poetry. And he was a politician in the city of Florence. So he sort of became the equivalent of being on the city council and holding some positions in the Florence city government, and a civic leader. But Italy at the time was being torn apart by bitter political factions. We were talking about this before the class started tonight. There were these two factions, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and the issues were very complicated and layered, and it's kind of hard to explain. But at the time, people were very bitter about it. You were a Guelph, you're a Ghibelline, and even those factions subdivided. A little bit like we argue about red states, blue states, or this or that. You try to figure out who's on whose side. But it was very bitter, and it divided everything. And it effectively became a low-grade, low-running civil war in the city-states of Italy for about 150 years. And the control of the city of Florence, who was sort of in power in Florence, flip-flopped between those parties. One generation would be the Guelphs, next generation the Ghibellines, then 30 years later, 20 years later, the Guelphs would come to power again. And Dante himself was a Guelph, but then the Guelphs subdivided into the white Guelphs and the black Guelphs. So the endless sort of subdivisions. And at one point, when he had begun writing this work that we know we're going to discuss tonight, the Divine Comedy, at one point when he was about halfway through with it, the political factions changed in Florence, and he found himself on the wrong side and on the outs, and he was exiled from the city. And he spent the rest of his life sort of floating around the city-states of Europe, getting hospitality from this duke or this earl or this lord or this wealthy person who would say, hey, I got this famous poet Dante, this guy is going to come and stay with me for a year or two. I've jokingly said to my Monday night class, he sort of couch surfed around all the best palaces of northern Italy for a number of years. But while he was doing that, he was finishing what we know as the Divine Comedy. He eventually ended up in the city of Ravenna on the Adriatic coast, where he died and had just finished the work right before he passed away, and was published 1 year after he died in 1321. Now, it was an immediate and unqualified success. Remember, it was published 1 year after he died, so he didn't get to live to see its success. By the way, mentioning that he was a contemporary of St. Francis of Assisi, he chose to be buried in a Franciscan habit of a third order secular Franciscan. And he chose a very simple burial. I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But the book, The Divine Comedy, just takes off. I mean, it just becomes like what we would call today a runaway bestseller. Everybody starts reading it. It's the book of the day, the book of the year, the book of the age, book of the decade. Everybody in Italy, everybody in Europe starts reading it. Everybody could afford a copy, gets a copy. So what is it? What is the Divine Comedy? What is this book that was so popular? Well, first of all, it's a story, but it's a story in the form of an epic poem. Now that bores the death out of us today. We don't have epic poetry. Nobody writes epic poetry. Nobody reads epic poetry. The most any of us have ever encountered of anything like it is maybe if we had a high school or college class, we maybe read part of the Iliad or the Odyssey at one point in our life. Well, that's what he modeled it on. In fact, he self-consciously modeled it on the works of Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, but more particularly the follow-up poem called the Aeneid, which was written by the Roman poet Virgil. A long, long, complicated epic story about the fall of the city of Troy and how the refugees from the city of Troy end up in Italy and found the city of Rome. And Dante thought that the Aeneid was the greatest epic poem, the greatest epic tale that had ever been told, and he decided to write one that was better than that. His ambition was to do something that elevated that art form as high as it could go. Now, the Divine Comedy is broken up into 3 books, or what they call canticles, but sort of 3 books. They're called Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, okay? Inferno refers to hell, and it's called Inferno because the Latin word for under the ground, hell, is infernus. And so it's not an inferno because it's hot, as you actually, when you read the Inferno, you realize it's not all hot and in flames, but it's inferno, under the ground, it's hell. Then Purgatorio, talk about it in a minute, and then Paradiso, heaven. It's about 14,000 lines of poetry, okay? Or 100,000 words. Now, I used to work in publishing, and so we always had length guides for books, right? So different kinds of genres of books. A 100,000 word book would be like a Harry Potter novel. Harry Potter novels are right around 100,000 words. So it's about the length of a Harry Potter novel. You could, if you just read through it, like I know people would read through a Harry Potter novel the day it comes out, but you could read through it in a couple of days if you wanted to. And here's the important thing that we need to know before we go any further. It's not funny. It's called the Divine Comedy, but it's not funny because it's not it's a comedy, but it's not a comedy because the word comedy has changed its meaning since in the last 700 years. So in classical literature, classical Greek and Roman literature, and even up through Shakespeare, there were 2 forms of a story, tragedy and comedy. And comedy didn't mean that it was funny, like haha funny, it meant that it had a happy ending. Tragedies would have a sad ending, like Hamlet, where at the end of the day, everybody's dead and dying on stage, or King Lear, okay? Or comedies where it had a happy ending. Everybody turns out well in the end. Well, here's the deal. The Divine Comedy turns out to have a happy ending because the main character, Dante sort of writes it in the first person, journeys down through the Inferno, up through Mount Purgatory, and then up through Paradiso to achieve the beatific with John. So his journey has a happy ending. Thus, he actually called it simply the Commedia. For the rest of the night, I'm just going to refer to it as the Commedia because that's how he referred to it. The word, the Divine Comedy, came from the Florentine writer Boccaccio. About a generation later, says this Commedia is such a great Commedia. It's like a divine Commedia. In the same way that Michelangelo was called during his day by his contemporaries, Il Divino, the divine one, because what he had done was so magnificent and divine. This is the Divine Commedia. So that's what the Commedia is. Now let me give you a quick summary of the story. In the story, it begins with the character Dante. So he's not only the author, but he's writing himself in the story as a character, so the protagonist. And the character Dante begins by saying, I was lost in the middle of my life. I was lost in the middle of a dark wood. It's a story of a man who has hit middle age, in the middle of all the problems of life and confusions of life, all the compromises that he has made in life, all the ways the world has compromised him. And he feels like he's standing in this dark wood, a forest, and he doesn't know his way out of it. And so he actually, the character is, I'm lost in this forest, middle of my life, lost. I don't know how to go forward. And he sees in the distance a sunlit mountain, sun glinting on the top. And he says, I want to get there. And that's heaven. I want to get to God, but I don't know how to get out of this dark forest. And he tries to climb up the mountain slope, but he can't because there's wild beasts and it's difficult. And so he becomes dejected and sits there in the forest when a guide shows up. And the guide is the Roman poet Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, that he wanted to model on it. And he says, hi, it's a ghost. I mean, it's the ghost of Virgil. And the ghost of Virgil shows up and says, I've been sent here to help you get to the top of the mountain, to get to God. Well, who sent you? Well, he tells this whole story. It was Mary, the Blessed Virgin Mary, who's up in heaven with God, looked down and saw poor Dante lost in the dark wood of life, wanted to help him out. She turns to the Blessed Saint Lucy, who's next to her, who turns to this woman named Beatrice, who's an old friend of Dante's, and sort of exemplifies for Dante everything that's beautiful and good. And so Maria says to Beatrice, who says to Lucia, or says to Lucia, who says to Beatrice, you really should help this guy out. So Beatrice goes down and gets the ghost out of limbo of the poet Virgil, because she figures that he'll listen to Virgil because he admires Virgil so much, and sends Virgil to say, I'm going to be your guide to show you how to get to heaven. And he says, to get to heaven, you can't get there directly because there's no way you can get there on your own. There's only one way to get there, and it's a dark and dangerous journey. He says, you have to descend first into death and hell and sin. And having descended through that, and they do, they descend through the levels of hell and sin, and then they ascend Mount Purgatory and up into the paradise. And all this occurs on Easter weekend. They start their descent on Good Friday. They emerge at the base of Mount Purgatory on Easter Sunday. They climb during Easter week to the top. And so obviously what he's doing is he's describing the gospel. This is the gospel. We don't get to heaven on our own. We have to die to our sin, and we must descend with Christ into death to be risen and ascend to heaven. And so it's really a gospel journey, and it's a pilgrim journey of the gospel, of the pilgrim journey of our life. So it describes this epic tale. Now, I could talk about it. It's 100,000 words. I've got a class that's going on Monday nights. I am personally a Dante geek. This is the city of Florence. And when you go to the city of Florence, and by the way, if you want to go with me, I'll take you and show you, because I'm leading a trip there again in May. But and this is this is the baptistry of John the Baptist right outside the Duomo, the Cathedral of Paris. And there's actually a story in the Divine Comedy, in Inferno, where Dante tells the story about how when he was like on the city council at Florence, there was a kid drowning in the baptistry, and he had to go rescue him in that building there. And this is the statue of Dante in front of the Church of Santa Croce, the Basilica of Santa Croce, the big epic statue, because there's a tomb in this big church of Santa Croce there, and everybody goes to see the statue in the tomb. But, oh, and by the way, this is Dante's house in Florence. I had to go to Dante's house several times. But he's not in that tomb. Dante, it's like, is Grant who's buried in Grant's tomb? Dante isn't buried in Dante's tomb in Santa Croce because they exiled him and he died in the city of Ravenna. And so on one of my trips to Italy one time, I forced my poor daughter to spend an entire day driving halfway across Italy so that we could go to Ravenna and stand in front of the poet Dante's sepulchral tomb. So, and he's in there. Florence, for 700 years, has asked for him back, and Ravenna said, no. So Dante has this imaginative scheme, and real quickly, here's the deal. And again, he kind of does world building, right? I mean, this isn't literal. He's telling a story, right? He's using imagination. As I said before, when you look, when you go to the Sistine Chapel and you look up and you see Michelangelo's painting of God reaching down to touch Adam's finger, Michelangelo's saying that literally happened that way. He's creating a piece of art and imagining it. So Dante's imagining something so he can tell the story. And here's, in his imagination, this is obviously the earth. And what happened is when Satan, in his imagination, his backstory, when Satan fell from heaven because he rebelled against God, he crashed into the planet Earth like an asteroid, creating this massive crater, right? And went down to the center. And in Inferno, Satan is in the center of the bottom of this crater. He's stuck down there. It's the coldest, darkest place in the universe, far from God. And when he did that, it blew out the other side of the earth a mountain. And this illustration doesn't quite show it well because this looks smaller than that. But the mountain matches the crater. So blew out, this is hell, this is internal. The crater that was created by Satan's fall. And it blew out a mountain on the other side, which is Mount Purgatory. And over this, you see this says Jerusalem, there's a little cross, is over that crater. God over time kind of covered it over with earth. And this is Jerusalem, and this is the Mount of Calvary, the cross where Christ died, directly over the pit of hell. And also, of course, on a direct line down to Mount Purgatory. If you flip kind of the world a little bit upside down, or you see it this way, if we were to invert this or turn this around, what Dante does is he journeys down through Inferno. He goes through this little passageway, he comes out and he climbs Mount Purgatory. That's the second book. And then the third book, Paradiso, he ascends into the heavens, into the stars, closer and closer to heaven, to meet God. So I'm a bit biased. I think it is the greatest Catholic story ever told. In fact, I may argue it is the greatest story ever told. Dante, his ambition was to write the greatest story ever told. And what I would like to do with our time that we have left this evening is I think it's a pretty bold claim to say it's the greatest Catholic story ever told. And so bold claims require substantiation. So I'd like to give you 7 reasons why it is the greatest Catholic story ever told. So here we go. Reason 1. Oh yeah, see, right there. See, this is like flipped around. So he goes down through hell, and then you come out Mount Purgatory, and then you ascend the levels of heaven up to, see Dio, that's God. So the first reason why it's the greatest ever story ever told, that story, is its scope. This is why Boccaccio called it the Divine Comedy, because frankly, there is nothing like it not only in Catholic literature, other than the Bible itself, nothing like it in Catholic literature. Nothing even rivals it in its scope. This is a story that attempts to tell in one book the history of the universe and the cosmos, the history of God, Satan, the fall, the story of salvation, and take the reader on a journey to the pits of hell to meet Satan, up through the saints, through purgatory and all the punishments and sufferings of purgatory, all the way and to ascend to the top of heaven, to the beatific vision. That is an epic story. Simply the scope and scale of the story is beyond anything. In fact, it may be unlike anything in Western or even world literature. I struggle to think of anything that rivals it. I don't know of anything in Western literature. When Dante set out to write, he wanted to write a greater story than the Aeneid, and he actually said that he thought this would be the greater story because the Aeneid told of the founding of Rome, and he wanted to tell of the fate of the universe. And he wanted to describe and capture a vision of the entire universe, things seen and things unseen, things on earth and beneath the earth and in the heavens. So in terms of scope and scale, there's nothing like it. In Protestant literature, as Mark mentioned, I spent a lot of years as a Protestant, and there was an epic poet named John Milton, who in the 1600s wrote sort of the Protestant attempt to mimic Dante, called Paradise Lost, and a sequel called Paradise Found. And I won't say I wasted an entire semester in college, but I spent an entire semester in college taking a graduate course where we did nothing but read Paradise Lost for like 16 weeks in excruciating detail. And so I feel pretty qualified to say that Paradise Lost doesn't stack up to Dante. I thought it was pretty cool when I read it when I was 19 or 20, but then I read Dante and I went, oh. Dante says, you know, hold my mead, let me show you this. So nothing else in literature lays out the cosmology, takes us from the floor of hell to the pinnacle of heaven and all the steps and layers in between. But I think that's a thin way of looking at it, because it only is looking at sort of the vertical scope, you know, hell, paradise, hell to paradise. But you often have to look in the Commedia what he does in terms of its horizontal scope, because he covers everything. It's a story about everything. He covers love, marriage, sex, politics, art, war, science, literature, history, astronomy, geography, economics. Because in going through this, and he basically goes along and has these interviews or dialogues or conversations with all the people he meets along the way. So he meets people in hell, and he meets people in purgatory, he meets people in heaven, and he talks about them, and they tell their stories, and they give their opinions, and they discuss issues in the church and in the world and in life. And he basically unpacks every field of human life. So it has this vertical depth, this vertical scope, and this horizontal scope. He talks about basically everything. It is a story and a poem. It is a book about everything above the earth and below it. I'm reminded of that passage from Colossians 1, where Paul says that Christ is the image of the invisible God, and through him all things were made, whether things above or below the earth, on the earth, all things, all powers, everything that can be imagined was made by Christ. Well, Dante is basically writing that story and trying to tell of everything. And one of the things is when I say that nothing is like it, one of the questions, why has nobody tried to write something like it in the last 700 years? I don't know. I mean, in some sense, it's like Dante did a drop mic moment. Write something better than that. And no one has frankly been equal to the task. Now, we're not familiar with it today, and I'll say why in a minute, but we're not familiar with it today. And partly because no one's made a movie of it or a Netflix series of it. And so, largely our education system, we don't read these kinds of things in school anymore, and we don't read them in church. And so perhaps the greatest work of Catholic literature is unfamiliar to us. But let me quote some people who have something to say about it. The popes have talked extensively about the Commedia. Paul VI said this. Pope Paul VI said, Dante's poem is universal. In its immense scope, it embraces heaven and earth, eternity and time, divine mysteries and human events. It addresses sacred doctrine and teachings drawn from the light of reason, the fruits of personal experience, and the annals of history. Paul VI went on to say this: there may be some who ask why the Catholic Church, by the will of its visible head, meaning the Pope, Paul VI himself, who's writing this, is so concerned to cultivate the memory and celebrate the glory of the Florentine poet. Our response, meaning Paul VI's response, Pope's response, he says, our response is easy. By special right, Dante is ours, exclamation point. Ours by which we mean to say of the Catholic faith, for he radiated love for Christ. Ours because he loved the church deeply and sang her glories. And ours also because he acknowledged and venerated in the Roman pontiff the vicar of Christ. So, in scope, it's the greatest Catholic story ever told. Reason number 2, craft. So Dante set out to write the most masterful work of literature that would ever be conceived. He wanted to drop mic. He wanted to do the greatest thing, like Michelangelo when he carved the David or the Pietà, or he painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or the Last Judgment on the chapel wall there. Michelangelo is conscious of trying to create the greatest thing that could be possibly created. Dante did that. But here's the deal. When people set out to do great things, you have to be able to, execute it, right? It's one thing to have the ambition to carve the greatest sculpture or write the greatest piece of music, compose the greatest piece of music, or write the greatest story. You have to be equal to the task to be able to pull it off. When you look at someone like Michelangelo and you go see the Pietà or you see the David, and you realize that he pulled it off in a sublime way, a way that nobody has ever been able to match since, right? There's a reason why we go look at the Pietà still, or we look at the David still, because there's lots of statues. There's nothing quite like that that's been done since then. And because he pulled it off, he was a masterful craftsman. Well, Dante is the Michelangelo of Catholic literature. But to do it, you have to understand it, and it is less accessible than Michelangelo. In other words, if you go to Rome and you walk into St. Peter's Basilica, you can look up and see Michelangelo's dome and go, you know, a million people do. They're all walking around with selfie sticks and everything else, going ooh ah, right? And you walk in and you look to your right when you walk in, and here's the Pietà, and you go ooh ah, and everybody takes a picture of the selfie stick and does that. You can see it. Same thing with the David. But reading the Commedia requires effort, right? It's 100,000 words. It's 14,000 lines. It's hard. It's complicated. It's not just like looking at a statue. Oh, my facial recognition. There we go. Okay. Sleep. So, and we don't read hard things anymore. It's not something we do anymore. As a culture today, we no longer read hard books. I worked in publishing for a number of years, worked for Zondervan, HarperCollins. Nobody reads any hard book, right? The whole point is write books that are easy to read. We used to say, our movies used to be books brought to the screen, and now our books are movies brought to the page. So you make a Batman movie, or you make a, whatever movie, and you Pixar movie or something, you go, oh, cool, hire a ghostwriter or something to sort of like put the movie on a page so we can sell it. We can leverage, it's called leverage the IP and sell it, franchisable intellectual property and sell it. We don't read anything hard. Try to give kids in a literature class or kids in college a hard book to read, a book that requires that you learn how to read it, a book that has all kinds of references in it. The Divine Comedy comes from that tradition of the Commedia that up until like 50 years ago, one of the signs of being educated, of achieving a certain degree of education, is knowing sort of the canon of references. So when you read a book and it refers to characters from literature or history or this or that, you know what those mean. It's like reading Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's always dropping these references, right? And I remember I still grew up at the tail end of a time when you go, it was expected, or a goal or an ambition of an educated person to be able to read one of Shakespeare's plays and know what he's talking about, be able to understand all his references. It's a joke today. No one's going to do that. And so the Divine Comedy is a work of such exquisite craftsmanship, but it largely becomes inaccessible to what is really, sorry to say, is sort of a post-literate culture that we have in America today. Our poetry is just prose rearranged on the page in a different way. Nobody writes poem that scans and has meter and rhyme. And, Dante invents an entire rhyming scheme for this. His cantos are written in this kind of special rhyme scheme with a special syllable meter pattern that's, very structured. We just don't read anything like that anymore. And we think it's odd that someone would have to make effort to read. I mean, anything that's good should just be simple and easy. You should be able to pick it up, and it should be a simple, easy breeze. And the truth is, to learn to read Dante, you have to study. You have to have good notes. You can get study tapes. You can take books of, there's various things on the internet, courses. I'm teaching a class through L.A.N.E on Dante, and you can take that or any other kind of other sources, but you have to learn to read it. And if you'll do that, if you don't allow yourself to be dumbed down, it will take you into this larger world in the same way that, I go back to the Shakespeare thing, reading one of Shakespeare's plays, reading King Lear and understanding what's going on there and understanding it takes you into a new world. And Dante takes you into that world because it is a structured, highly exquisite poem that makes every line is a reference to literature, scripture, history, theology. I mean, like I said, he was essentially a contemporary of Thomas Aquinas and these guys, and he's dropping references and nuances in this thing. So it's hard to read, but it's worth it, and it's full of so much beautiful complexity, the narrative, the language. I mean, little things like not only the rhyming scheme, but his craftsmanship is such that, for example, In Inferno, the language he uses has sort of a different tone and rhythm and vocabulary because you're in hell. And the way people talk in hell is different. And as he starts ascending up through purgatory, and the people he meets, now these are people who, are being going through purification of purgatory, but there's grace there. And so the language is elevated, the vocabulary and stuff. And as he moves into Paradiso, it becomes, and so he actually structures the language and the tone and the voice in ways that are so fascinating. Reason number 3 why it's the greatest Catholic story ever told is truth. Faithfulness to Catholic doctrine. As I said, I quoted a moment ago from Pope Paul VI, the popes repeatedly have said, read Dante, read Dante, read Dante, because he is faithful. This is faithful Catholic literature. It is true, right? And so in Catholicism, we're on this quest for what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. And it is, and of course, the Divine Comedy is the epitome of not only beauty and a search for goodness, but it's full of truth. As I said a moment ago, he's a contemporary of St. Francis of Assisi, a contemporary of Thomas Aquinas. He comes out of that age. And I've said before that it is as if somebody was taking the theology of St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Francis of Assisi and bringing that to life. If you take all of their doctrines, all of their theologies, and say, now imagine what that looks like. That's what the Commedia is. And so I got into a long discussion today with somebody who was asking a question about something that we were talking about in the class. And we were making the point of, well, what does Thomas Aquinas say about this? And I said, well, let's go and take a look at what Thomas Aquinas says about this issue and see how Dante then took the theology of that and sort of brought it to life in a visual way. And so it is true. He steps up to the challenge. It's faithful in that way. And that's one of the reasons why Protestants are totally turned off by Dante. Okay. So when I was in the Protestant world reading Paradise Lost and this and that, Protestants do not like Dante's Divine Comedy. Don't like it. Oh, they'll make a couple of references to some scene or something maybe in Inferno or whatever, but they absolutely, well, they hate the middle book, Purgatorio, because they don't believe in Purgatorio. And they hate the whole premises that it's based on. And that's why I say it's not just, I stress it's the greatest Catholic story ever told, because it is profoundly Catholic. And it is Catholic theology brought to life. An analogy with, say, the Michelangelo thing would be if when you go to the Vatican and you go into the Sistine Chapel, against the altar wall is the giant painting. It's almost like the size of a tennis court. It's this massive fresco of the Last Judgment. And it's a whole interesting story about how that painting, some other time I'll tell it, about how that painting got painted, because what happened was the Reformation was going on in Europe. And so the Protestants, Lutheran, whatever, bashing the Catholic Church, they're bashing Catholic theology. Europe, the church is being torn up by what the church considered these heresies and these attacks by the new Protestant reformers. And they were sort of launching the Counter-Reformation. And one writer put it this way, said the Pope had 2 secret weapons to respond to the Catholic, to the Protestants. The first was the Council of Trent. He would assemble all the bishops at Trent, and they would take apart, they would take the Protestant arguments, and they would address them, and they'd reform the church. And his second secret weapon was Michelangelo. And so he hired Michelangelo and said, paint me on the altar wall what Catholic theology looks like. And sometime, if you ever, I have a giant print of the Last Judgment on the wall of my office. And when you look at that, and someday if you ever get to see it in person, and you start understanding that all of the nuances of Catholic theology over and against, because Michelangelo intentionally painted that to say, the Pope commissioned him to say to Luther and the rest, well, look at this. This is Catholic theology brought to life visually. And that's what really the Commedia is. And so therefore it is, in some sense, polarizing for those who, don't like Catholic theology, right? If you don't like Catholic dogma, if you don't like Catholic doctrine, you're not going to like the Commedia, okay? But if you do understand and you do revel in Catholic truth, then it's like looking at the Last Judgment on the Sistine Chapel wall and going, oh, that's it, that's it, that's it. That's what Catholic truth looks like. And by the way, I think Catholic art, that's the gift of Catholic art, is to take truth and make it beautiful. So when we look at a Michelangelo or we look at other Catholic artists, it is that ability to take Catholic truth and through the gift of the imagination to, in a sense, bring it to life in a way that touches our hearts and is beautiful. And as somebody who worked for a lot of years in the Protestant art and creative and literature world, it's something, and one of the reasons I was on this road to Rome, and one of the reasons I'm here tonight, as opposed to being at a Protestant conference like I used to speak at, is that one of the things that occurred to me over decades of working in the sort of Protestant art and creative and media world is that Protestant art is didactic. In other words, when we do a book or we do a movie or we do whatever, we say, well, we have to make a point. So the characters and everything else are pounded in to be a sermon to make a particular teaching point to you. And so therefore, you always feel when you're reading a Protestant novel or watching a Protestant or evangelical movie that you're being subjected to basically a 3-point sermon that's just being acted out. And it becomes didactic. And yet the gift of Catholic art, the Michelangelos and the Dantes or whatnot, is that your imagination is left to be struck by the beauty because, as the Catechism tells us, truth, goodness, and beauty are 3 pathways to God. In other words, God is ultimately, the Catechism tells us, he is truth, goodness, and beauty, the ultimate compilation of those. But when you discover what is true, and if you follow what is true, and you follow that path, you'll end up at God. And if you follow what is good and you follow that path where it leads, you'll end up at God. And if you follow what is beautiful and you follow that path, it'll converge with the true and the good in God. And so Catholic artists are free to do things that are beautiful, genuinely beautiful, knowing that they don't have to make their points. That's why you can, talk about the Commedia, just go back to Michelangelo, we're all more familiar with. You can look at the David and go, I don't know exactly what it means. I just know that it's beautiful and it conveys truth and goodness. And I want to know more about that. And it will draw you in. And that's what the Commedia does, is great art. In fact, in terms of the popes and their endorsements of Dante, Benedict the 15th, not the 16th, Benedict the 15th, so 1921, issued a statement, and he actually was quoting in this apostolic letter that he wrote, he was quoting Leo the 13th and St. Pius the 10th, so basically a whole passel of popes. And here's what Benedict the 15th said about what all the popes think. They said, Dante Alighieri is our own. Quoting him now, he says, indeed, who can deny that our Dante nurtured and fanned the flame of his genius and his poetic gifts by drawing inspiration from the Catholic Church to such an extent that he celebrated the sublime mysteries of religion in a poem that is almost divine in itself. So you got 3 popes signing on to that statement. So the craft is masterful and divine. 4th reason why it's the greatest story ever told, Catholic story, is wisdom. So it's not only true, but it has profound insight. There's this word, a Hebrew word called chokhmah. So when you go to the wisdom books, so the book of Proverbs and Psalms and Song of Songs and whatnot, Ecclesiastes, there is a Hebrew word called chokhmah that's usually translated wisdom. But it doesn't mean like book learning. It means like insight and practical insight into the way the world actually works and the way life works. That's what the book of Proverbs is Chukhmah. It says, listen, my son, I shall give you Chukhmah. I shall give you real insight into the nature of the human experience, the nature of God, and the nature of life. And the Comedy is full of Chukhmah. So it's not just an erudite piece of art or an erudite piece of theology, it actually has real insights. So things that we've been talking about, say, in our Monday night class, but I would highlight here, are things like, for example, one of the things that runs through the Comedy is what I call the law of love. The law of love. What's the law of love? And I sort of intentionally coined that phrase because you go, oh, well, that sounds like love doesn't have laws, right? I mean, we're all like, in the 21st century, like, woo, love is free and we don't have law. But there is a lot of love. And he gets this, Dante does, from St. Augustine. And St. Augustine has a passage where he says that love is like gravity, or love has a gravity. That the thing that you love, like it's like a gravity, like a planet, it will draw you toward it. And it will draw you toward it forever. And so Augustine says the law of love is what you truly love, what you really love, you'll be drawn to it for all time. So be careful what you love. Because what Dante unpacks in the Divine Comedy is that all of the people who are in Inferno or in hell are there because they're getting exactly what they really wanted. Everybody in hell, in a sense, put themselves there. And in a sense, Mick Jagger said, well, you can't always get what you want. But actually, in Inferno, or Dante says, in the universe, you do. God's justice is in the end, you do. And it reminds one of C.S. Lewis's statement in Mere Christianity. And of course, Lewis was a medieval scholar, a medieval literature scholar, and he knew his Dante very well. And I became a Christian partly through reading C.S. Lewis when I was 18, 19 years old. So I just chewed up all of his stuff. And then it was like, well, you used to read Lewis, and then you read Chesterton, and you start with Dante, and before you know it, you're like at the Catholic Information Center on a Tuesday night. Here you go. But here's the deal: like Lewis, I mean, a lot of Lewis's stuff, C.S. Lewis's stuff, is like he rips off Dante, and Dante rips off St. Augustine and whatever. Everybody's ripping everybody off because it's all true. And so anyway, one of the things that Lewis said in Mere Christianity is this: he said, on the last day, on the judgment day, there will only be two kinds of people. There will be those who bend their knee and say to God, thy will be done. And there will be those to whom God says, sadly, thy will be done. In the end, the law of love is you get what you truly love. So be really careful about what you love. Tend your heart. There's another really touching scene. I'm keeping on the time here, but a really touching scene in Purgatory. It's in the very top of Purgatory, on the top of the Mount Purgatory, shaped like a 7-tiered wedding cake. It's like this 7-layered cake. In fact, Thomas Merton's book, The 7-Story Mountain, is just a ripoff of Dante's Purgatory, the 7-Story Mountain. And when you get to the top, you get to the terrestrial paradise, the Garden of Eden, because you now have achieved been innocent. All that our fallen humanity has been burned away in you, and you get back to what Eden was supposed to be. But when he gets there and he enters the terrestrial paradise, he meets Beatrice, and his guide Virgil has to go away because Virgil can't take him any further. And so he's all excited that he finally gets to see Beatrice, who's come down from heaven. And she says, he goes, well, the pains are all behind me now. And she goes, no, there's one last pain. And it will be the most painful of all the things. It will pierce your heart more than anything. And that is that you will see yourself as you really are. And Dante at that point has journeyed through this, and he's cleansed. And so now, from a place of innocence, he looks and sees how he has wasted his life. And that's the greatest pain of all, of I have wasted my life and how I failed to live up to the potential gifts that God gave me. And it's just a remarkably touching scene that has this sort of hukmah and wisdom about life. There's a some of more of that hukmah and wisdom. There's another principle that runs through Dante, which is the burden of freedom. Kind of goes with the law of love. And again, the burden of freedom isn't a burden. They go, well, actually it is. Because think about it this way, the choices you make have genuine consequences, not only for you, but for those around you. Freedom implies responsibility. It is responsibility. And freedom is responsibility with consequences. And the choices that you make with your freedom will impact not only your future, your eternal future, but so many people around you. I mean, in the Commedia, so many times he interviews, souls along the journey who talk about their lives and the reasons they ended up where they ended up. And some of them, talk about how their lives impacted people around them. Maybe the families or their town or their businesses, or he meets politicians and kings and popes. He meets several popes in there, and meets a couple of them down in Inferno, right? And they talk about how the poor decisions that I made impacted the lives of so many other people. So freedom is not a pass, it's not a privilege, it's a responsibility we must take seriously. And there's insight there. He has hukmah insight into. Here's another one. I'll give you just a little snippet that I think is really remarkable. So in Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan is this noble creature who makes these epic speeches. He says, "It is better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven." And he's kind of a cool figure in Paradise Lost. Like he's flopping around, making these cool speeches. So he has all the good lines in the thing. When Dante gets to the bottom of Inferno, he sees Satan, and Satan is frozen up to his waist in ice, in a lake of ice. There's two reasons for that. One is he's as far from God as you can get, so it's a cold, dark place. But more than that, what Satan is doing is he has these big bat wings, and he's flapping his bat wings, Dante says, so fast that it's creating a wind, and the wind is freezing the lake. Now, you go, well, that's so weird, you're like, what is that all about? But then you think about it. And he's mute. This was Lucifer, the morning star, the greatest of the creatures that God made, who wanted to soar through the creation of the heavens and the angelic realms and be free. But because he rebelled against God, what he has come to is all of his desire to flap away from God and be free just freezes him in place and renders him mute. And you think about the wisdom of that and how that applies to our own lives, that all of my struggles, all of my gyrations, all of my running around, all the things I try to do to be independent of God actually end up immobilizing. That's an insight that Dante brings in these things, a sort of wisdom. And he's worth reading just for that. A couple of other quotes from some popes. Pope Francis said, "I propose reading the Commedia as an epic journey, indeed a true pilgrimage, personal and interior, yet also communal, ecclesial, social, and historical." Pope Francis wrote this just this last March, okay? He issued a papal encyclical on the apostolic letter on the 700th anniversary of Dante's death and the publishing of the Commedia. And so Pope Francis says, it's an epic journey, indeed a true pilgrimage, personal, interior, yet communal, ecclesial, social, and historical, inasmuch as it represents the paradigm for every authentic journey, whereby mankind is called to leave behind what is bad and pursue what is good. And so Pope Francis is this wisdom, these insights are so valuable and useful, not only to us as individuals, but for us to come together in the church and do this together. And Pope Francis went on to say, Saint Francis and Dante had much in common. Francis, with his followers, left the cloister and went out among the people in small towns and the streets of the cities, preaching to them and visiting their homes. Dante made the choice, and Pope Francis says, which was unusual for that age, to compose his great poem on the afterlife in the vernacular. So what he did is he didn't write it in Latin. He wrote it in a Florentine, a Tuscan, the dialect of Tuscany and Florence, which, because of the popularity of the Commedia, by default became Italian. So in a sense, he invented Italian. Because at that time, there were all these little dialects floating around Italy, and all these things, people have different sort of versions of language, but he writes it in the street language of Florence and Tuscany. And the book is, because it's such a runaway bestseller, everybody starts reading it and they start talking that way. And it becomes Italian. And Pope Francis is making the point that in the same way that Saint Francis went out among the people to bring, help them cultivate their relationship with God, Dante brings these great truths to people. Of course, we now, 700 years later, don't have the education or capacity, because our schools haven't prepared us for that, our churches haven't prepared us to be able to read it and understand it, which is why I'm so glad some of you are here tonight, because it's something that we should work on. And he says, Pope Francis says, another feature common to the two was their sensitivity to the beauty and worth of creation as the reflection and imprint of its creator. Okay, a couple other reasons why it's a great story, and then I'll stop and take questions. I'll start with this. Virgine madre, figlia de tuo figlio. Virgine madre, figlia de tuo figlio. Perhaps one of the greatest lines of all literature, and when I talk about wisdom and insight and craft. In the Commedia, this is a line that he has when he is in Paradiso and he sees the Blessed Virgin Mary. And it translates as Virgin Mother, daughter of your Son. That is, in a few words, one of the most profound, gifted insights. I always think about Michelangelo, how when he crafted the Pietà, there's so much insight in that, right? Without going too far down this path. All the curious things about the Pietà, right? So like, Jesus is like 33 years old and Mary looks like 14. She doesn't look like a 50-year-old woman or whatever, right? 47-year-old woman, she looks like 15. And also, if you were to make them stand up, and people have done this sort of proportion study on him, like she would be like this and he would look like a hobbit. His body is too small, proportionate to hers. And she never touches him. Oh, by the way, it's not biblical. There's nowhere in the Bible where Mary is like holding the crucified Jesus on her lap. So what is Michelangelo doing? Well, he's saying profound things. He's offering us genuine insights and wisdom through his art. Because what he's doing is he's portraying Mary not at the moment of Jesus's death, but at the Annunciation. This is the moment of her fiat. When the angel Gabriel comes to her and says, you shall bear the Messiah, in essence. And she says, yes, I will. And she offers him to the world. And in a sense, at that moment, at the Annunciation, this is what is foreshadowed, is it will come to this. And so in the same way that Michelangelo, just by how he carves this, opens us up to truth about the Blessed Virgin Mary, so this incredible paradox, how can you have a virgin mother and how can she be the daughter of her own son? And yet that brings us to the paradox of the incarnation. And so Dante, in just a few lines, captures that. Reason 5 would be the impact that he had. The impact that Dante had is unquestionable. He invented the Italian language. It was incredibly popular in its time. It has withstood the test of time. publishing stats in terms of one of the most popular things that has ever been written. In some sense, its popularity is self-limiting because nobody can copy it, nobody could duplicate it. You can create a genre on it. It hasn't been made into a movie because how would you even pull that off, right? So, but its impact is unquestionable. Let me quote again from Pope Francis's letter this last spring. Francis, the Holy Father said, Dante's work is an integral part of our culture, taking us back to the Christian roots of Europe and the West. It embodies that patrimony of ideals and values that the church and civil society continue to propose as the basis of a humane social order in which all can and must see others as brothers and sisters. And Pope Francis calls this an essential part of our cultural patrimony as the church in the West. Okay, last reason 6, testimony. The last reason why it's the greatest story, Catholic story ever told, is because you know what? You know who said that? The popes said that. Lots of people have said that, like credible people have said that. So let me just quote a few more lines from Pope Francis, and then I'll stop and take your questions. Pope Francis said in his letter this last Feast of the Annunciation that Dante reads the depths of the human heart. And everyone, even in the most abject and disturbing figures, he can discern a spark of the desires to attain some measure of happiness and fulfillment. Dante stops and listens to the souls he meets. He converses with them and he questions them and thus identifies with them and shares in their torments or their bliss. Starting from his own personal situation, Dante becomes the interpreter of the universal human desire to follow the journey of life to its ultimate destination, when the fullness of truth and the answers to our life's meaning will be revealed. And in the words of St. Augustine, our hearts will find their rest and peace in God. And so, Pope Francis says, it is fitting then that the present anniversary, being the 700th anniversary of the publishing of the Commedia, serve as an incentive to make Dante's work better known and appreciated, accessible and attractive, not only to students and scholars, but all those who seek answers to their deepest questions and wish to live their lives to the full, purposefully undertaking their own journey of life and faith, with gratitude to the gift and responsibility of freedom. And this great heritage cries out to be made accessible beyond the halls of schools and universities. I, therefore, Pope Francis, urge Christian communities, especially in cities associated with Dante's life. I urge academic institutions and cultural associations to promote initiatives aimed at making it better known, making his message better known in all its fullness. And that is why Mark was gracious enough to invite us to be able to speak about it here tonight. A lot of Catholic institutions are heeding the Pope's call and celebrating Dante and making it accessible. We have a course at the Lakeshore Academy for New Evangelization. I have some flyers in the back. You can go to our website, lanecatholic.org. We have lots of courses and things to see there. I've been doing a year-long course on the Commedia. It's all available. If you haven't been with us up till now, it's all archived on the L.A.N.E website. So you can catch up with us. And then we're going to pick it up here again in the spring semester. Lots of opportunities. And I'll be leading a trip to Florence and Rome and Assisi in May. So if you want to come along and join us, I'd be happy to take you to Dante's house and show you it all there. So thank you so much. And I'll open to your questions or comments.
Great. Why don't we stop sharing the slideshow?
Yep.
Stop share.
What about number 7?
I miscounted. There was a number 7. It was Dante's life and stop sharing. Okay.
There we go. Then you can see.
Okay.
Yeah, we invite those of you on Zoom to turn on your cameras and use the raise hand function. If you'd like to ask a question of Greg, and of course anyone here can also use the raise hand function, and we can have a bit of conversation about Dante.
How old was he? So he was born I'll do the math in my head, 1265, and he died in 1321. So 50, what is that? 50 something?
What's his education?
Well, he, like a lot of people those days, they're sort of, Renaissance polymaths. You look at in Florence those days, they're sort of self-taught with tutors and things like that. So, you look at the Michelangelos and the Da Vinci's and all of these great artists, education, the universities, what we know as the universities, were just being invented in Dante's day. But it was very common for all of these guys, like Michelangelo never went to art school. These guys, what you did is you were tutored when you were a child. Your parents hired good tutors, and then you generally apprenticed as a craftsperson under a master. So Dante in Florence had tutors, and then he worked underneath masters and learned literature and poetry and politics and all those kinds of things.
It's just an epic amount of information.
Oh yeah.
That one person holds together.
Oh yeah.
And creates this story with such depth and division.
Yeah.
Right. And you just like, how does that happen?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious who had to read, just on a survey of hands, who had to read Dante, one of Dante's books in high school.
Ding 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 ding.
So I'm very excited.
And I think that's so interesting, because as I said, I could have gone and quoted the popes for 15 more minutes. I have like 6 pages of papal quotes from the last 700 years of their endorsements of the thing. This is one of the greatest works ever. And like I said, it's the Michelangelo or the Summa Theologia or whatever, the City of God of Catholic literature, and yet it's just in our culture. I dare to think that 50, 100 years ago, it was standard reading in any kind of a Catholic institution or college or university. I mean, you couldn't, you had to read Shakespeare, you had to read this, certain things that were part of the canon. And then what happened is I mean, we're living through something that I like to call the great forgetting. We're living in the last number of years, a couple of decades, through the great forgetting, where we are forgetting our cultural heritage, we're forgetting our patrimony, we are forgetting our history, our theology, we're forgetting the great works of art. We just don't know these things. Nobody knows them. They're certainly not going to teach them in school. They're certainly not going to teach them in high school or college anymore. You're not going to see, if you watch Netflix, you're not going to see this stuff. You just don't know. You have to make extraordinary efforts. You have to come out on a Tuesday night to the Catholic Information Center or go to L.A.N.E to even learn this stuff, because it's not available. So, I mean, I think that's exactly why Pope Francis said in that last quote I gave, we have to make this known beyond the halls of some university classroom, that you do an upper division literature course in, some Catholic university. This needs to be known, and it needs to be talked about in the churches. And we need things like the Catholic Information Center or the Lakeshore Academy, spreading this kind of information. Yeah.
I just don't even know if you could do it on your own ever. At this point in our life, we bought the first book, Inferno, and started reading it. You don't know the innuendos, so you read something, it doesn't mean anything.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, it is not the most accessible thing to read. It takes, like I said, it takes work and effort to be able to read it. And I think that's true with a lot of things. I mean, when was the last time you picked up a Shakespeare play like King Lear and tried to read it and understand what he's talking about with all these sort of references and things? And I think, like I said, we're living through a time where that's a crisis, and we have to, we have to work. The good news is we're also living through the age of the greatest dissemination of educational information in the history of the planet. On our smartphones, we have the capacity to have all of the information of the ages compiled for us. Whether that's an event like this or a classic we have, or, I mean, you can go, I mean, I for example, I'm addicted to, and have for a lot of years, whenever I'm in my car or walking my dog or doing anything, I'm listening to books on, well, not books on tape anymore, but they're books on my phone, or I'm listening to college courses. So, I mean, I'll refer, of course, the Lakeshore Academy, if you do Evangelization, go there and sign up, and we have lots of stuff. But also audible.com, this books on tape. I have a subscription to that, so I get 2 books a month. I burn through at least 2 books a month on that. And then there's another thing that I get called the Great Courses, which it's a subscription. It's like $20 a month or something. But you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of college courses and you just download them into your smartphone, and on everything. I mean, everything from, you know, engineering to science to literature to, you know, any topic. And so, you know, my family doesn't necessarily enjoy this, but when I'm driving in the car or I'm walking the dog, I'm taking a college class or listening to a book. And the thing is that, you know, throughout history, people would have killed to have this access to information that we do. So, you know, back to the point, Kathy, you know, we can study, we can learn. We have to, you know, we have to choose to do it. But you're right, it's not accessible because we haven't had the educations. I don't mean that in a negative way, but just, well, you know, we haven't been taught how to read this stuff. Yeah, Mark.
I saw Meredith had unmuted herself. I don't know if you have a question, Meredith, but.
Yes, I do, Mark. I have on my Kindle Dante's Inferno, and I'm interested in learning more about Dante. Is there any books that you would recommend for someone that wants to learn more about Dante and his Inferno?
Yeah, I think probably the best and most accessible one, and we can try to find a way to post it, but if you'll use the Google machine and enter Anthony, Anthony, Esolen, Esolen. Anthony Esolen. He's a Catholic professor of medieval literature, and he has done several books on Dante that are available not only in print form, but he has them on digitally. Yeah, Audible. So he's got some on Audible you can download. He's got several lecture series. He's got one on on Dante, and Esolen is just a masterful teacher, great faithful Catholic literature professor, and really engaging to listen to. Also, if you're looking for a translation of Dante that has really good footnotes of the Inferno, I recommend Anthony Esolen's translation of.
Oh, okay.
And in his, he has like on every page, like just these endless like notes and footnotes, tells you what everything means. So Anthony.
Okay, yes. Oh, okay, thank you. Because I looked on Amazon and I know there's different translations and not.
Yeah.
And on my Kindle, I do have the Dante's Inferno by Dante Alighieri, and I noticed that there was different translations,
Yes.
so that's why I wasn't sure.
Yeah,
which
there's
one
lots of there's lots of translations, and like everything, you know, even with modern language, you know, like translating one thing to another, different translators, you know, have different emphases. Some are easier to read than others. You know, I recommend the Esolen translation. I think it's a very, very accessible by Anthony Esolen, his translation, and then his translation has these great footnotes. And then if you want to listen on Audible to his, he's got several lectures on Dante that I think are quite good.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
The other resource I would recommend, and I'm going to drop it in the chat, I'll make sure I send it out on a follow-up email, is there is a new website that was created.
100 Days of Dante.
100 Days of Dante.
Yeah, that's a fantastic, we've talked about it in our class. 100 Days of Dante encourages you to read the entire Commedia in 100 days, notes, and it has all kinds of great resources. And that's a project that was put together this year in response to Pope Francis by a university.
Yeah.
I think it was Baylor University.
Yeah.
Go Bears, where my son got his PhD. Go Bears. But yeah, Baylor University put that together. It's a great resource. 100daysofdante.com, I think it is.
Yeah. Does anyone have any more questions, comments, jokes? Well, Greg, any closing remarks?
Yeah, just you know, things that are worthwhile. I guess I'm going to make. I'm kind of pounding this nail into the wall pretty deep, but I think that things that are worthwhile sometimes, you know, you have to work for them, and we want the easy button on everything. And, you know, whether it's studying scripture or great works like Dante or understanding the nuances of great pieces of art like Michelangelo or whatever it is, we have to be willing to invest ourselves in that journey. But the church, the Catholic Church, promises us that if we pursue what is true and what is good and what is beautiful, that those are pathways. In other words, by making the effort to study scripture, to study literature, to study these art, to study these things, there are ways that open us up, as the way the posts have said, open up our faith to us and open God up to us. So I hope that all of us will be on that pilgrim journey, and we all have limited time and resources. We can't do everything, but that we should always be finding something that you're working at. You should always have something that you're studying. I had my first job that I ever got was in a bookstore when I was 16 years old. And the manager of the bookstore used to tell me, or whenever I saw him every week, he'd say, "What are you reading this week?" I was 16 years old. And he was like, "What are you reading this week?" There should always be something. You should always be reading something. You should always be studying something, always be learning something. And if Dante is something that there's great resources, or some of these other things that we've mentioned, always be learning something.
Excellent. Well, Greg, thank you for the learning you've offered for us tonight.
Yeah.
I know I'm personally inspired to pick Dante back up again, although I wonder if reading it now at this time in my life, instead of when I was in high school, I might contend that now it's post-midlife crisis. And I remember you started it with that he's lost in the wood, right, in midlife.
Yeah.
So I wonder if it won't be a comedy because it's true.
Yeah.
So, hey, thank you all
Thank you very
for
much.
being here. Greg, thanks very
Thank you
much.
so much.
For